My name is Linda Parker, and on Christmas Eve, I learned exactly what my only son thinks of me. I was standing at the far end of my cousin Carol's long dining table, trying not to tremble as I set down the steaming tray of lasagna I had baked since dawn. The room glowed with soft gold lights and the kind of warmth families are supposed to share during the holidays. Yet my palms were damp, and my heartbeat felt loud enough to echo off the crystal glasses. Mark didn't even look at me when I placed the dish in front of him. He leaned back in his chair, straightened the cuffs of his gray wool blazer, and pushed the tray away with the back of his hand. As if my food carried shame he didn't want touching him. Then he said it, slowly, clearly, loud enough for 26 relatives to turn their heads and freeze in place. Failed mothers don't deserve to sit at the table with us. For a moment, I couldn't tell if the ringing in my ears came from his voice or from something inside me cracking open. The fork in my hand slipped and struck the edge of a plate, a sharp sound slicing through the silence. I saw Carol's husband pause mid-pour with the gravy boat. I saw my cousin's kids stop whispering and stare. And beside Mark, his wife Ashley lifted her wine glass with a small, satisfied smile, as if she had been waiting years to see me fall apart in public. My throat tightened, but the tears that threatened to spill never quite reached the surface. I stood there, lasagna cooling in front of my son, wondering how a lifetime of sacrifice could be dismissed in one sentence. That was the moment something in me finally shifted, though I didn't understand it yet. Because the real story, the reason my son believed I no longer deserved a place at his table, began long before that night. I wasn't born with the kind of strength people like to praise in old women. I didn't grow up expecting to survive heartbreak or sacrifice. Life carved those things into me slowly, the way water carves its path through stone. And before that Christmas Eve, before my son's words cut through the room like a blade, I had lived decades believing that love, especially a mother's love, could outrun disappointment. When Mark was 5 years old, everything I knew about stability vanished in a single phone call. It was close to midnight, and I had fallen asleep on the couch, waiting for my husband to come home from his late shift. The ring of the phone startled me upright. I remember the officer's voice, deep and apologetic, stumbling slightly as he explained there had been an accident on Interstate 71. Rain, a jackknife truck, no time to brake. By the time the words, "We did everything we could," came through the receiver, I was holding my breath so hard I nearly fainted. Mark wandered into the living room, rubbing his eyes, confused by the light and the sound of my shaking hands. I pulled him into me, brushing his hair back with fingers that could barely stay steady. I didn't tell him that night. I waited until sunlight touched the kitchen tile. He cried so violently I thought his small ribs might break from the force of it, and I held him, whispering over and over that I would take care of everything. I had no idea how, but mothers learn quickly that promises are sometimes made before certainty. Money tightened around us like a fist. I kept the mortgage by the skin of my teeth. I took a custodial job at Jefferson Elementary because it came with health insurance, even though the hours were cruel and the work unforgiving. When those shifts didn't stretch far enough, I accepted evening cleaning jobs at an office complex downtown. Sometimes I left for work before the sun rose and returned home long after Mark fell asleep with his homework still spread across the coffee table. There were days when my feet ached so badly that removing my shoes hurt more than wearing them. Nights when my palms cracked from bleach and cold water. But Mark would run into my arms every time I came through the door, and for a few small seconds, all the exhaustion lifted from me. He was bright, hungry to learn, always curious. He brought home spelling bee ribbons and math worksheets covered with gold stars. His teachers told me he was the kind of student who could go anywhere, do anything. When he reached high school, college became the new horizon. I knew what higher education cost. The numbers felt unreal, like someone else's problem printed on brochures handed to parents who could actually absorb the weight. But Mark wanted it, and I wanted him to have the life I never could. I refinanced the house. I signed the federal Parent Plus loans. I stared at the interest rates, the totals, the years of repayment stretching into a future I tried not to imagine. But the night I signed the papers, Mark hugged me so tightly my breath caught. He whispered, "I'll make this worth it. Mom, I promise." I pressed my lips to the top of his head and let myself believe him. College changed his schedule, but not our closeness. At least not at first. During freshman year, he called every Sunday night. He told me about his professors, the laundry machine that kept eating quarters, the girl down the hall who knitted scarves for half the dorm. I sent him care packages with homemade cookies, instant coffee, and little notes that said things like, "Proud of you," and "Keep going." He always said they made his week. By his junior year, the calls came less often. He said he was busy. Group projects, internships, networking events. I understood, or at least I told myself I did. That's what growing up is. After all, learning to loosen the grip without letting go. After graduation, he landed an entry-level operations job at Riverside Health Network. The salary wasn't huge, but it was solid, stable, a foothold on the ladder he dreamed of climbing. He moved into a one-bedroom apartment with gray carpeting and a balcony barely large enough for a chair. He sent me a photo the day he got his key, standing proudly in the doorway, the sunlight behind him making him look almost golden. He visited often that first year. We ate takeout on my couch, and he'd rest his head on my shoulder the way he did when he was little. Once, as he folded the blankets from our meal, he looked at me with a seriousness that startled me. "When I get promoted, I'll help with the loans," he said. "That money shouldn't all fall on you." I didn't ask for dates or amounts. I didn't want to risk turning a moment of love into a transaction. I simply nodded, grateful he remembered, grateful he cared. But ambition began carving space between us. His office changed floors. His responsibilities doubled. He started using words like optics and culture fit. The suits he wore got sharper, tailored, more expensive, and little by little, I saw the first hints of something I couldn't yet name, something like discomfort when people found out what I did for a living. I ignored it. Mothers do that. We pretend the cracks aren't cracks. We tell ourselves our children are just tired, or stressed, or distracted. I didn't know then that the distance growing between us wasn't temporary. It was the beginning of something larger, something that would one day lead to the sentence he hurled across a Christmas table, as if I were a stranger, rather than the woman who had once worked 3 jobs just to keep him fed, safe, and dreaming. The first time Mark brought Ashley home, spring sunlight was spilling across my front porch, warming the chipped paint I kept promising myself I'd fix. I remember smoothing my thrift store blouse as they walked up the steps. Mark looked proud, nervous, even, as if introducing her to me was an important milestone. I wanted to feel excited for him, but something inside me tightened the moment she crossed the threshold. Ashley was beautiful in a way that felt deliberate. Every strand of hair was perfectly fixed. Every button on her camel-colored coat gleamed like it had been polished on the drive over. She smiled at me, polite and cool, offering a soft handshake that barely grazed my fingers. There was nothing unkind in her expression, at least not openly. But something behind her eyes assessed my living room, the mismatched frames, the aging sofa, the old family photos, like she was cataloging flaws she wouldn't mention out loud. Mark talked the entire dinner, filling the air with stories about his new department lead, the training seminars, the office politics he found exhausting, yet thrilling. Ashley laughed in all the right places, touching his arm with a familiarity that told me her influence over him had already taken root. When she turned to me, her question seemed innocent, but her tone held the faintest edge. "You still work at the school, right? Must be tiring keeping up with all those floors. I don't know how you do it at your age." I forced a smile. Age wasn't the issue. It was dignity. But dignity is quiet, and people like Ashley rarely listen for quiet things. Their engagement happened faster than I expected. The wedding was held at a country club overlooking a golf course so perfectly manicured it barely looked real. I wore the nicest dress I owned, though it still felt out of place among the designer gowns and tailored suits. The ceremony was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being a guest in a world where I didn't belong. At the reception, a server tried to direct me to the far tables until Mark corrected him gently. Ashley's smile slipped for a second, just long enough to reveal something sharper beneath the sweetness before she tucked it away again. Even then, I didn't want to think badly of her. I reminded myself that new families take time to blend, that insecurities can make people behave in ways they don't understand. When Noah was born 2 years later, I let myself hope. The first time I held him, something inside me reawakened. He wrapped his tiny fingers around mine and stared up at me with Mark's old softness. For a moment, I believed this child would draw us closer again. But the rules began almost immediately. No unannounced visits, no sugary snacks, no hugging the baby unless Ashley was watching, no staying more than an hour, and each restriction was delivered with a smile, always sounding reasonable on the surface, yet somehow each one nudged me farther from the center of their lives. I told myself not to make waves. I didn't want Mark to feel torn between his wife and his mother. Still, the quiet rejection cut deeper than any argument could have. The worst blow came on Noah's 5th birthday. I arrived early with a homemade chocolate cake, the same one Mark begged for every year growing up. I'd saved for the ingredients, stirring the batter at dawn, dusting the top with cocoa just the way he liked. Ashley stared at it, her expression unreadable. After a beat, she turned to the caterer and said, "We'll stick with the cake we ordered." Then she leaned toward me, dropping her voice to a confidential whisper. "Homemade things don't really fit today's aesthetic. But thank you." She tossed it into the trash before I could think of a response. The sound of the container hitting the bin made something inside me flinch. Mark watched it happen. He touched my shoulder briefly, murmured something about not making a scene, then walked away to help arrange the balloons. That night, I cried in my car where no one could see. Things only worsened from there. When Ashley discovered that I had been meeting Noah after school, just simple visits on a park bench, sharing stories and snacks, she called me in a fury. Her voice was sharp enough to cut. "You don't take our child anywhere without permission. If you show up again, we will call the police." Mark backed her without hesitation. His tone was cold, efficient, almost professional, as though disciplining an employee rather than speaking to his mother. After that, I stopped going. I stopped asking. Even texting became a delicate negotiation, my messages shrinking into polite questions that often went unanswered. Months passed like that, quiet, lonely, heavy. I kept working, kept paying down the loans that still hovered over my life. And though I told myself I'd grown accustomed to being pushed aside, some part of me still believed Mark would eventually remember who I was to him. I had no way of knowing that the message inviting me to Christmas Eve dinner, the first invitation in months, would lead to the moment that shattered whatever was left between us. 2 weeks before Christmas, when the sky darkened early and the cold settled into my joints more sharply than it used to, my phone buzzed with a message from Mark. It wasn't warm or personal, just a single line that might as well have been copied from a work email. Christmas Eve dinner at Carol's, 6 p.m. You can come if you want. No greeting, no love you, no invitation implied beyond the bare minimum, yet my hands trembled as I read it. I'd spent nearly a year watching him drift into silence, letting Ashley draw invisible borders around every part of his life. This message, thin as it was, felt like a rope thrown across a widening gap. I told myself not to hope, but hope is stubborn. It rises even when you beg it not to. I prepared for that dinner as if my presence needed justification, as if I had to earn a place at a table I once took for granted. I bought fabric on clearance and sewed myself a soft beige dress, the kind that might pass in a room full of better clothes. I used a coupon at a small salon to get my hair trimmed. And that morning, I began cooking Mark's favorite lasagna, layering the pasta with ricotta and the sauce I'd let simmer for hours. By the time I arrived at Carol's house, the windows glowed with warm light and wreaths hung from every doorframe. Laughter floated from the living room. Children chased each other down the hall, and relatives I'd known since childhood hugged me with the kind of affection that warms the frozen edges of the soul. Then Noah appeared. He spotted me from across the room, and his face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. He ran to me, arms flung wide, and I felt his small body collide with mine. For a moment, the air returned to my lungs. "I missed you, Grandma," he whispered, pressing his cheek into my shoulder. I held him as long as he allowed, until Ashley swept in smoothly, her expression tightening just enough to reveal annoyance beneath the politeness. "Noah, sweetie, hands are dirty. Go wash up before dinner." Her tone wasn't harsh, but it carried a warning meant for me. Mark arrived a little later. He looked like a polished version of the boy I once raised. Tailored blazer, expensive watch, hair styled in a way that said he finally had the kind of life he once dreamed of. He moved through the room greeting people with easy charm, but his eyes skimmed over me as if I were part of the decor. Dinner began with turkey, mashed potatoes, casseroles, and bread baked fresh by Carol. Conversation buzzed around us, warm and familiar. I waited for the right moment, searching for courage I wasn't sure I had, before standing with my dish. I carried the lasagna to the main table and placed it gently in front of Mark. My heart thudded in my chest as I smiled, small and hopeful. "I made your favorite." For a heartbeat, I believed he might soften, that he might remember the years when this dish meant comfort, when he'd beg for second helpings and sneak bites before dinner was served. But he didn't even look at it. With a slow, almost elegant motion, he pushed the tray away with the back of his hand, as though protecting himself from something unclean. "I'm not eating that." The room quieted. Forks paused. A chair creaked somewhere. My breath caught in my throat. But before I could speak, he raised his voice just slightly, enough to ensure everyone heard. "Failed mothers don't deserve to sit at the table with us." The words hit me like a blow. My grip loosened on the edge of the dish, and I steadied myself against the table. I heard a gasp. Carol's, maybe? Someone whispered his name in disbelief, but the loudest thing in the room was the absence of anyone defending me. And then, out of nowhere, Noah's chair scraped sharply against the floor. He stood, trembling, his eyes bright with tears he refused to let fall, his fists balled at his sides. "You don't get to talk to Grandma like that," he said, voice breaking. Mark stiffened. "Sit down. Noah, that's enough." "No," the boy said, louder this time. "She loves me. She loves you, and you treat her like she's nothing." Ashley shot up from her seat, her voice sharp. "Noah, lower your voice." But Noah kept going, words tumbling out like a dam breaking. "And she's still paying for your college loans. You never pay her back? I saw the bills." Whispers erupted around the table. Faces turned. Ashley's head snapped toward Mark, fury flashing in her eyes. "What loan?" she demanded. Mark paled, his mouth opening without sound. Noah walked to me then, took my hand, and squeezed it with a determination that didn't match his small frame. "If Grandma leaves," he said, "I'm leaving too." He tugged gently, guiding me away from the stunned silence, past the wreath-lined door, into the cold night where snowflakes drifted like ash. And this time, I didn't look back. The cold wrapped around us as Noah led me down the quiet street, his small hand clutching mine as if he were afraid I might disappear if he loosened his grip. Snow drifted in slow flakes, muting the sounds of distant laughter from Carol's house. We stopped at the park a few blocks away, the benches dusted white, holiday lights strung across bare branches like trembling stars. I set the lasagna beside us, still warm despite the walk. Noah took a fork, scooped a bite, and closed his eyes as if tasting a memory rather than food. "This is the best thing I ate all night," he whispered. Those words, simple and earnest, cracked something in me far softer than anger. I pulled him close, feeling the shiver in his shoulders. He told me then, in a halting voice, about the tension in his house, how Mark came home exhausted, how Ashley's criticisms felt constant, how he tried to stay quiet to keep the peace. He said he missed me, not just in moments, but in his bones. "I don't feel like myself there," he said. "But with you, I do." I wanted to reassure him, to make promises I couldn't keep, but the truth pressed heavy against my ribs. I could love him fiercely, more fiercely than anything in my life, but I couldn't shield him from the choices his parents made. Headlights cut through the snowy dusk, and Mark's SUV rolled to a stop beside the curb. He stepped out, jaw clenched, voice strained. "Noah, get in the car. Now." Noah hesitated, but I squeezed his hand. "Go with your dad," I murmured. "I'll be all right." He climbed into the back seat slowly, looking at me until the door closed. Mark didn't say a word before driving off, the tires crunching through the snow. The next morning, he called. His voice was calm, almost casual, as if the night before hadn't happened. He talked about his year-end bonus, the house he and Ashley wanted to buy, the stability he'd worked so hard to build. Each detail dropped like a stone into my stomach. When I mentioned the loans, the debt I was still carrying, he let out a short, hollow laugh. "You made those choices, Mom, don't put them on me, and just to be clear, you're not seeing Noah without our permission. If you try, Ashley will call the police." His words settled into me like winter frost. When the call ended, silence filled every corner of my house. But grief has a strange way of making space for clarity. 4 days later, my phone rang again. The number was unfamiliar. "Linda, it's Helen." I hadn't seen her properly in years, though she'd always been the cousin who watched the family's chaos with quiet, discerning eyes. She cleared her throat. "I was at Carol's dinner. I saw everything. I also recorded a video. I didn't mean to, but the camera caught the whole moment." My breath caught as she continued. "I've spoken to a family law attorney. You have options, and you don't have to face any of this alone." Her home was warm and understated when I arrived. She poured me tea, sat beside me on the couch, and listened, truly listened, as I recounted years I had tried so hard to survive with grace. When she finally spoke, her voice held a steadiness that felt like shelter. "You deserve better, Linda, and Noah deserves someone in his corner." The months that followed unfolded slowly, shaped by court hearings, mediation sessions, and truths brought into the light. The judge watched the video, listened to witnesses, and spoke firmly about respect and the welfare of a child. Noah told her he wanted to see me. His small voice carried more weight than any argument Mark tried to make. In the end, I was granted visitation, 1 weekend a month, 2 video calls a week. Mark agreed to contribute toward the loans, and though the victory wasn't loud or triumphant, it settled inside me like a long-delayed breath. 6 months later, on my 65th birthday, Noah handed me a handmade photo book filled with pictures of our days together. On the last page, he had written, "So you never forget that you are loved." And for the first time in a long while, I realized I didn't need a seat at Mark's table. I had finally found my own.